your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Please be seated.
If you are visiting with us today, let us say how wonderful we are and happy we are to have you with us. Hopefully you've gotten one of those visitors packet. At this time, if you would slide those attendance cards to the aisles. We have some men who will come by and pick those things up. You now are seeing what I'm seeing, and luckily each week I print these slides off and put them up here for a reason. And we're having some technical difficulties today, so bear with us. For all you who are part of the 70 West congregation, I have a challenge for you starting in February. And the challenge is, if you love them, bring them. If you have friends or neighbors or co-workers or family members that you love who need to hear the gospel, bring them. If you have family members, friends, those who are part of the church, bring them. We're going to try this the whole month of February. Each time we meet, we want to have 125 visitors in the month. That's a big number. What does that mean for you? That means you can't sit by and say, well, I hope we get that. You're going to have to help us out a little bit. So, if you know anyone that you can bring them. Now, I'm not going to be so hard-pressed on you that I won't count a visitor more than once. We want to have 125 visitors. Put that on your to-do list for the month of February. That's going to lead into something in the month of March, but we'll let you know that the closer we get to March. 125 is our goal for the month of February. There came a point in time in which Adam and Eve, or Eve rather, was deceived, and Adam foolishly followed right along. At that point, they gave up the perfection in which they were made. As God looks around on those 6 days and said, it is good, it is good, it is good, and on day 6 saying it is very good, He has it exactly, that earth, those people, those animals, that plant kingdom, exactly the way He wanted it. Perfection. We see them in Genesis chapter 3. Surrender all of God's work over to one. Surrender their innocence. We see them surrender their perfection. We see them surrender their safety. We see them surrender their home. It just so happens, at the end of that particular account, we have Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15. Genesis chapter 3 and verse number 15 is the first place in the Bible in which the gospel is mentioned. And perhaps you say, preacher, that's not the case. Oh yeah. Oh yeah, it is. It's not just the case that it is the first place that the Savior is mentioned. It's the first place that the gospel is mentioned. First of all, there's going to be warfare between two people. One's going to have your best interest at heart. One is not going to have your best interest at heart. This one who will have your best interest at heart, according to Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15, will be born of a virgin. Found right there. The gospel. When you see this warfare, this enmity that happens between them, you'll see that one is a success in his duty and one is a failure. I'll bruise your heel while you deliver a crushing blow to his skull? And realistically, as you and I look at the end portion of Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15, we need to ask ourselves this question: which side do you want to be on? This Bible that you hold in your hand is not a history book. It's not a biology book. It's not a book of genealogies. It's not a book of archaeology. But it is interesting that every point in which the Bible hits on those subjects, it's exactly true. You know, without another verse to tell us about Jesus the Christ, or His coming, or how He will come, or what He did while He was here, God told us enough in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15 for us to choose. Now, it is the fact that God knew even from the beginning that He was going to create me. Because He knew that, He knew I would need a little more help than the average person. And so He began to add verses in here to solidify my faith. Let's see if it does the same for you. About Genesis chapter 12, as you and I rush forward just a little bit in time from Genesis chapter 3, where the gospel is first mentioned, we have it mentioned once again to Abraham, and he said, I'm going to make you 3 promises. The first promise is, I'm going to make you a large family. The second promise is, I'm going to give you a big land for that large family. And the third promise is that I'm going to bless every nation in the world by you. And you say, well, how is that a prophecy of Jesus Christ? How in the world do you think the rest of the world is going to be blessed if it's not through Jesus the Christ? Genesis chapter 49 and verse 10, God will write down there that the scepter will not depart from Judah. Not only do I know this Messiah who's coming is going to win, I know He's coming from the family of Abraham. I know He's coming from the tribe of Judah. And then in our history of time, we back up from Genesis to Job. And we see a man who is so righteous. We see a man who makes the right decision to follow after God and has given his life in that fashion so that when Satan comes to God, God says, have you considered my servant Job? Try him out. See what he'll do. At the end of chapter number 2, we see a man who has lost everything in his world. We see a man who's lost all of his livestock. We see a man who's lost his children. We see a man who is broken. By the end of chapter 2, we see a man who is covered in boils from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. We see a man who doesn't look like a man. As a matter of fact, in chapter 3, his friends come for a week and they begin to look at him and they're so repulsed by him they can't even speak. We catch him in chapter 2 at the local dump. Scraping his skin. Searching for some relief somewhere. Throughout that book, as his eyes are opened a little further to the gospel. In chapter 9, he says this, man, I wish I had someone who would stand in between me and God and be able to regulate the rules. You know what he's asking for? The one person we really don't want to see in a sporting event, the umpire. So I wish I had someone who would go between us and Job chapter 13, 16, he's still making that declaration. I want someone to stand up for me. I want someone to implore God for me. And it comes to him in Job chapter 19 and verse number 25 as he has gone through this growth process. As the gospel has been revealed to him slowly, he writes these words, it says these words, I know that my Redeemer liveth and will stand on this earth in the final day. Job himself knew about the gospel. As we look down through the history of time and through our Bibles, we read 2 Samuel chapter 7. God will tell us that the seed that Israel is so desperately searching for will come through the house of David. Then David will write about the victorious power of the cross. See, when David writes Psalm 22, he's writing a prophetic statement of Jesus the Christ that you and I can read about in the Gospels. And as we read about him there in the Gospel of Luke, we read about him crying out. We did a little word study this morning in our class as we were looking at this particular phrase. And the word there would be Jesus. His phrase would be megaphones. Does that sound familiar? Sound like an English word, you know? Megaphones, megaphone. He would pull himself up and screech out like what we would think of as a crow. That screeching sound, and he would say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And if you look at that closely, what you'll read is, the God who is of me, why have you left me down in this? Some 1,000 years before it happened, David writes about the saving power of the cross. Some 750 years before it happens, Isaiah writes about the cruelty of the cross. His visage so marred, 52, that you can't even tell he's a person. By his stripes we are healed. Remember all those things? And God, verse 12, will see the travail of Jesus' soul, and his wrath towards sin will be satisfied. We read throughout the book of Ezekiel and Jeremiah and Lamentations of how God is trying his best to save his people, but his people are walking away from him. Micah chapter 5, verse 2 and 3. We move from the cross and we go back 33 years in Micah chapter 5 and we look at where he's born. We see him being born in Bethlehem. We see Zechariah telling us that he's going to be born in this fashion, in this way, and that he's going to have power over those things that are what we would call the metaphysical, the spiritual things. You ever ask yourself this question, why were there so many demon possessions? Jesus Christ is going to prove who he is over and over again. Not through just the physical things, but through the spiritual things. Jesus Christ is going to show himself as that Messiah that God has been preparing us for all these years. And every one of these verses, some 333 or so, are fulfilled in that one person. I don't know how many people lived on the earth when Jesus the Christ lived. But right now we have somewhere close to 8 billion. That's a lot of folks. Would you take the chances 8 billion and one? No. What about if you were to have the chances of all of humanity, or one? Every verse God has given us from Genesis chapter 3 and verse number 15 all the way through that Old Testament has been pointing us to this one single fellow. This one. Those men who were tasked with writing the newspaper of the day when Jesus was born, when Jesus was alive, were not Christians. As a matter of fact, they didn't even buy into the fact that Jesus the Christ was the Christ. Many of them were pagans. Many of them were following after self-interest. And yet when they write down those oracles of things that happened while they're alive, they have to, by truth, have to speak of this one who's named Jesus of Nazareth. This one Jesus who had followers. This one Jesus who was a religious leader. This one Jesus who, with miracles and signs and wonders, healed people, fed people, had compassion toward people. This is from the history of hostile witnesses. If you put this up against the history of the Bible, you know what you find? You find this one Jesus of Nazareth, from Nazareth, who will be called the Christ, who had people follow Him, who was a religious leader and still is, who would find people who were hurting and hungry and blind, and dead. And in every instance, when Jesus would speak of those, or the Bible would speak of Jesus, He would look on them with compassion. Have you ever looked at someone in their physical state, or their spiritual state, hurt you? Right down here somewhere. Now you're beginning to understand, look onto someone with compassion. I can see that person. Can you see him 38 years sitting by that pool of water, waiting for the water to disturb, trying to get in there before anyone else? Because the rumor around town was when that water was moving that the angel of the Lord was using it. Can you see that guy never being successful? Tries and he tries and he tries as he might, but he can't get in there first. You're not the angel of God. but the very Son of God come to him and say, "What are you doing?" "I'm waiting to get into this water to be healed." Oh. Can you see him having that blind beggar calling out to him, "Son of David, heal me"? Can you see him answering the questions of two sisters? If you'd have been here, our brother would not have died. There are a lot of reasons why I would like to spend just a day in the shoes with the men who walked with Jesus. But one of those is this. One of those reasons is this. Was it physically visible on his face when he would look at someone and have compassion toward them? Would it hurt him that badly? When we look at Jesus in history and we look at Jesus in the Bible, we see the same man. We see a man that was born in Bethlehem due to a civil census that had to happen. We see a Jewish boy who was registered at the proper time, in the proper place, even with the proper sacrifice. Do you remember the sacrifice? Remember the sacrifice that was made for him by his parents when they went to register him? 2 turtle doves. Does that tell you anything about his parents? 2 turtle doves, poor as dirt. History and the Bible will tell us we see Jesus who grows up in Nazareth. We see Jesus who didn't make a lot of friends by the things that he taught. Here's what he taught the Jewish nation. "I know what you have been doing, but I also know what God has prescribed, and you're not meeting that standard." What are you saying, Jesus? "I'm saying you're coming up short. I'm saying what you're doing is wrong. I'm saying you have no motive behind what you're doing." See a Jewish man who attends Passover several times. We see Jesus of Nazareth who was convicted wrongly, as the Bible will tell us, convicted wrongly as history will tell us, and crucified. We see that body from history and from the Bible taken down and put into an unused, guarded grave. Now, if you don't think there's anything to raise an eyebrow about that, I don't know what to do to help you. How many of you ever been to a cemetery or graveyard around here? How many? Anybody else awake? Anybody ever been to one? Okay. You ever been to one with guards? All right. There's a couple who have. I have never been. You know what I know? You don't guard dead folks. Where you put them is where they're going to stay. Why was his tomb guarded? What we read about in history is the same thing we read about in the Bible, and yet it's not reported exactly the same way. After 3 days, Jesus walks out of the tomb. The Bible will tell us, history will tell us, that there were sightings of him all over Jerusalem. 3 days after he was put in a... Imagine that. What we'll find out through history and through the Bible is this. And 50 days later, a movement began that still bears the Christ's name. Still, even to this day. Some 2,000 years removed from that beginning, it still holds to his name. There was one church that was built in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 2, and there's still only one church. What we find about from Genesis chapter 3 and verse number 15, we need to go no further to understand that's the gospel and the saving message of Jesus the Christ. It would be Paul who would write in Romans chapter 1 and verse number 16 that this is the power of God unto salvation. What power? Well, Galatians will tell us the fact of the matter is a sinless man sinned, and it was by necessity that a sinless man die. That's the gospel. You find yourself, and I find myself, not in a sinless condition, but in a sinful condition. We find ourselves looking at what can save us and mankind. We begin to look at that Bible and ask, is it true? And history confirmed those things. In John 20, or 21 rather, as Mary's in that garden, she begins to ask what's happened to the body of Jesus the Christ. Her fear is someone has come and taken it, and so they cannot make those final preparations on the body of Jesus. She begins to explore and ask those questions. She begins to ask one that she thinks is a gardener, until he says, Mary? In that same lilt in his voice. Sparks her memory. And she says, Jesus? She's confronted with seeing Jesus after His resurrection face to face. You know what her inclination was? To grab Him and embrace Him. And He says, hang on a minute. Don't do that just yet. I've not ascended. You don't have the opportunity to be in that garden on that day, seeing that resurrected Christ in that form. But what you do have is the opportunity to see Jesus throughout history. Over the past some 6,000 years, have that Bible reveal those passages from God to remind you of who He is and why He came. And let me ask you this, what are you going to do with Him now? What are you going to do with Him now? Are you going to embrace Him? Or are you going to walk away from Him? That's the decision that is offered to you every time we meet, and every time you open the Bible, and realistically every second of every day until the Lord returns. What will you do with Jesus? You know that old song, the question comes to you, and you must give an answer for something you must do. You're going to run to Him or walk away from Him. And that's what you're going to have to choose. If you're going to run to Him, you're going to run to Him by hearing what He has to say and believing those things. If you're going to run to Him, you're going to run to Him by repenting of your sin and confessing that Jesus is the Christ. If you're going to run to Him, you're going to be baptized in water for the remission of your sins, being added to the family of God. You're going to run to Him, embrace Him, and thank Him for saving your soul. Or you're going to walk away from Him and say, that was a great way to spend a half an hour. I don't think I believe all that. I knew a man at one time who did believe all that. Caught up in the cares of this world and the desires of self, he decided to forget about knowing about all that. And where he finds himself now is swiftly coming up on the end of his life, knowing what he could do to change, and knowing that he never will. Don't forget what you know. Understand that God's Word is truth. It holds this very seed of life for us if we simply will just give ourselves to Jesus the Christ in submission and do what He says. You know, if you've done those things and you've been added to the church, might be the time of life where you look back and say, man, I could have done this different. I should have done that a different way. I should have approached this or that differently. Put down those things. Come home right now while we stand and sing for your encouragement.